Mental wellness is a big part of a successful expat experience, whether you're going abroad for a short stint or making the move long term. This is why you should visit the International Therapist Directory. It provides online listings of professional mental health therapists who are familiar with the expat as well as the third culture kid life. With over 250 members in more than 35 different countries, this resource lists therapists, counselors, psychologists, and psychiatrists interested in providing culturally sensitive, cross-cultural treatment and care for today's expat community. Visit internationaltherapistdirectory.com to find out more about this global therapy resource. In order to explain how this episode came to be, I have to talk about mental health. Unsurprisingly, mental wellness has become such an important discussion. You could probably chalk that up to more awareness, as well as people being more forthcoming about their struggles that have made it less of a taboo topic. And in expat spaces, it's the same. With awesome resources, as the International Therapist Directory, globally mobile individuals and families can find more professionals to discuss the ups and downs of life abroad. But I've been hanging around in these global mobile streets for a minute, and one challenge has always been to find Black and brown mental health professionals who've also lived the international lifestyle. And so I was on the hunt for resources for the Black expat community when I honestly stumbled upon my next guest. Enter Dr. Neeta Ramkumar. To be honest, I was geeked out when I found her. She's a former third culture kid, current expat, with PhD training in counseling psychology. And she's currently living in Cameroon. So with all of that, you know she's got a crazy good story. Neeta comes from an Indo-Guyanese background with a family whose roots in Guyana go back 5 generations before her parents separately immigrated to the United States. That by itself is a story in identity. But then you have to add her experiences living in Singapore and Malaysia as a third culture kid before returning to the U.S., living in Colorado and Texas, and then eventual moves that include France, Fiji, and now Cameroon. And then you can begin to start to scratch beyond the surface. Given her own background, Neeta often applies a cultural competency framework to connect with her clients. We spend a significant amount of time discussing what it means to belong, both when you do and you don't look like the local communities you're moving in and out of. We explore how living in Fiji drew her closer to being part of the Indian Diaspora. And we also examine the microaggressions and the privilege that comes with being a corporate expat of color, and the identity questions that require some wrestling. Her life story is somehow unique, but it is also oddly familiar in some ways. Welcome to the Global Chatter. So we're back with another episode of the Global Chatter, and I think I'm at the point where I'm doing all my interviews early in the morning. So if you guys get my morning voice, I apologize. But today is going to be a wonderful episode because, as all of you know and have been listening for a while, I love bringing in different perspectives around this expat, cross-cultural, third cultural kid, just anything having to do with crossing borders, stories and identities. And I think that having Neeta on here is going to be amazing because there are so many commonalities and nuances, I think, between the two of us that this is going to make this really enjoyable. So welcome to the chatter. How are you this morning?
Hi, I'm doing great. Yeah, thank you for taking the early call.
I mean, here's the thing. Between the two of us, I love this because no one can see video. You look great. I, on the other hand, I'm not going to tell the folks what's going on. I'm just saying between the two of us, she's radiating and I'm drinking warm beverages early in the morning.
Thank you. Had a couple hours ahead of you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it would be worse, right? If you were looking like me and it's like, what, 11? Is it 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock? What time is it?
Yeah, it's 12 o'clock here.
It might be 1.
12 o'clock in Cameroon.
Yeah.
Oh, y'all. And this is why I'm excited to have
Yeah.
her. Most of you know that I grew up in Cameroon. And when I found out she was in Cameroon, like, albeit she's not in Yaoundé, but it doesn't matter. She's in Cameroon. I was just like, I have to have her on the podcast because I rarely find folks who are able to come on who are living in Cameroon. So this is going to be fun. So, all right, let's kick it off with the first question. And this is what I ask everyone. But where does your international or cross-cultural living story really start or begin?
At least 5 generations ago, my family immigrated to the Caribbean, to Guyana, as part of the British colonial system as indentured laborers. And then my mother immigrated to the United States, to New York City, when she was 12 years old, with my grandfather had secured some work there, and all of her 8 siblings came on over.
Wow.
And then when she married my dad, when he was in his 20s, the rest of my dad's family came over. And so when I was a baby, I think my very first trip was actually to Guyana. I think I was something like 6 months old to a year, had a passport, and that was my first country to go. And we haven't been back since. That's kind of on the list.
Wow.
So our cross-cultural story, I think, started with this with 2 diasporas to the United States.
So your father as well grew up in Guyana?
My father did, and he came to the U.S. when he was in his 20s. And it's actually interesting to see like the generational difference between my mom and my dad, of having spent your teenage years growing up in the U.S. versus not. So
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So yeah, I mean, to really think about it, if we want to use these modern terms of TCKs, your mom at least, because she came as a preteen, right? And then your dad to a certain degree. I mean, of course, once you're on the other side of 20 seems really young. When you're like 20, you're like, oh, that's an adult. But like once you're like away from 20, I'm like, you're still a baby, because you're still forming your adult identity.
exactly.
And oh my goodness. And so, and I'm really interested, because I'll be honest, I don't know very many folks who kind of have that story. So you haven't had a chance to go back to Guyana. Have your parents gone back at all? Or
Not since then, not since that visit. So yeah, I think it's been on our list to kind of make a roots trip and go back at some point. So it's there, but that was what I'd call the first, at least, cross cultural journey. That's how I became a cross cultural kid, a child of immigrants, first generation American. And and when I was 6 years old is when I became a TCK. And my dad got a position overseas. He was with AT&T, and so off we went as corporate brats to Singapore, and it was an incredible, changing experience.
Oh my
we're
gosh.
just kind of settling in, being in a new country, and then all of a sudden to be representing the United States in Singapore.
And where did you? And I didn't ask this question. So when you guys left the States, what state was your family, like up until 6? Where had you been living?
We were living in New Jersey and Illinois.
Okay, so you were living more up north. Okay, and then you went to Singapore, which, once again, I think every time anyone mentions Singapore, I'm like, I love Singapore. I have such good memories of having traveled to Singapore. And so how long were you in Singapore for?
We were in Singapore for 3 years. Yep.
Okay.
And then my dad's, the project finished, and we decided to go to Texas. At that point, we had a ranch in Texas. My mom really loves animals. The ranch grew up on a farm, so I think the big city girl in her was really craving land. And so we went back to Texas, and my dad was looking into other projects, and we had such a hard time. We were living just outside of Houston, with the adjustment from this very multicultural environment in Singapore to very homogenous white suburb of
Yeah.
Houston, and within 6 months, my dad had found a job in Kuala Lumpur, and we just packed back up and we headed back to Southeast Asia.
Back to the peninsula, though.
Exactly.
That's Malaysia. Literally, for those of you who are terrible at geography or don't know this, Singapore and
Yes.
Malaysia are on the same peninsula. So he was like, let me go back to the Malay Peninsula.
Exactly. So, I mean, so when I say to people, I was like, really, we spent 5 years, like really 5 developmental years in Southeast Asia, with this little stint of culture shock in Texas at 4th grade.
In Houston. Well, here's what I'm really interested in, and you were young, so let's can you give me an age range? Were you like 6 to 11 for all of this, or maybe older?
Yeah, 6 to 12. Mm-hmm. Something, maybe 6 to
Okay.
11, something like that.
So here's what I'm interested in, right? Because you've already, just your story up until this point has already taken quite a few turns. So I know from my experience, having been to Singapore and then, what I understand of Malaysia, I'm really curious for you, and I know this is really early on, like what did identity really look like for you and maybe your parents? Because there is, and you're part of a diaspora community, right? In terms of having your family come from the Indian subcontinent to Guyana early, several generations beyond. But then being in Singapore, where Singapore has a very has a very strong Indian community, right? And in Malaysia, and then also like you referencing living in Texas, what does that look like? Because I've definitely been in spaces where, for lack of a better term, like I look like the people, but our stories are so different. So I'm wondering if that even came up, or because, or were the dynamics just different in Singapore because they were just so used to folks coming from all kinds of places that assumptions weren't made.
I love that. I think that this has been a little bit of a theme and an interesting addition, I think, to the like additional layer to the international experience for us. Because yeah, I think in some ways it was very nice to grow up in an environment where I could see like other South Asians and have that kind of reflected. And actually, it did allow us to learn more about certain aspects of our culture that we wouldn't really be able to learn in certain suburban parts of the United States. I think they're alive and well, like these pockets in New York, but elsewhere are kind of more difficult to find. But it was interesting because we're learning then and kind of incorporating another kind of diaspora India culture. And so one of the examples is one of our family traditions. We used to be getting masala dosa on Sunday. And so we would go to Little India and Singapore. And like ever since then, wherever we've lived, we have like hunted down where is a good dosa place, if it's like Boulder, Colorado or Austin, Texas, wherever it is. But so when people see us like loving our dosa, they really think this is something that we got ancestrally or through our generation. But nobody in like the Guyanese tradition or for our family did we learn how to cook this like South Indian dish. This came from our TCK experience in Singapore, and it was a tradition we adopted, right? And in other ways, I think, especially like to the example of it being of us being younger and kids is like an example that comes to mind with my sister who was in kindergarten at the time, and she got very confused on like National Day or International Day because the white American teacher had my sister sit down when it was like time for the American students to stand up and made her stand up for India. And so my poor sister comes home all confused, like, Mom, where am I from? And, of course, the teacher got a talking to by my mom. But this was international school. This is the American school, right, in the 90s, where you think that these things would be understood, but there's still the microaggressions and these different complexities of being an expat of color, an American expat of color.
Right. I even think it's funny when, even to this day, what people assume an American expat looks like versus what it could be. I feel like I felt that in the Middle East where people are just like, wait, you're American? I'm like, do you hear me though?
Yeah,
And they're just like, you speak English, right? Like it doesn't,
it
they're not
doesn't.
necessarily registering the accent, right? They're just like, you're just speaking English. But yeah, the fact that someone would assume, and I'm giving grace that it was the 90s. I would hope it would be better now, but I also don't hold my breath
Right?
because people can still make assumptions. But here's the other part to it then. Even okay, so that's even within expat spaces, and this may or may not happen, but I'm just even curious in Singapore and Malaysia, how did you have any interactions with the Indian Singaporeans or Indian Malaysians? Like, were there any interactions there and maybe even some assumptions there, or was it just, you know, no one really thought about it, or they were just like, well, we could tell they're American,
I think
they're not from
I
here.
think both. I mean, I think there was like, a little bit of privilege in being able to move through these places and markets and being able to call people auntie and uncle. But there was also the sort of uh, shut your mouth, kids, don't say anything while we're trying to bargain here. Because
Okay, which
once
is
you
like
guys start,
every black and brown person is just like, look, I no, we're not from the same place, but if I don't say anything, I might get the better
yeah,
deal. So you
yeah, like don't give
tell me,
yourself away. It's going to get pretty obvious once you guys start,
right?
open your mouth. So yeah, so I think there were some ways that we were, accepted, and I think the most powerful thing was just being part of a multicultural community and society at such an
Yeah.
young age. I think that made such an impact on me, and that's really what came out with that abrasive move to outside of Houston. It's just to
Right.
to be like, what is this,
Sorry.
and to be this exotic thing. And then people were thinking like, oh, okay, you're from Singapore. I was like, no, I'm not from Singapore. The same thing when we moved from Malaysia to Colorado, and to try to explain to people that no, I'm not Malaysian, just because we moved from Malaysia. But it was just, yeah, I guess I look like I could be, but I'm not.
Right.
And and the other side of it too is that I kind of learned one part is I think at a very early age, which you wouldn't expect to have to do this, but the role of being a cultural ambassador of
Right.
when people are like, well, you don't look American, and for me to be like, have you been to America? Like, here's what we look like. We are a multi-ethnic society, and and sort of having to learn to educate and inform really young in order to just even defend. I mean, to get out of the role of defending your own identity and more educating, like the ignorance or
Hmm.
whatever it is, because I think that's the only really cure to this is for somebody to tell their stories and explain, for them people to really assign like, okay, this can happen, and then maybe you'll change the world in some little way instead of just sitting there getting angry at being so misunderstood. But it's not easy, I think, to find the words to articulate this in elementary school.
Right. And that's, I mean, that's what I was going to say to your point. I think you are absolutely right. And especially for TCKs, expat kids, or just kids who just have a different identity, you find yourself having to argue and defend things at like 8. And it's, but it's a skill that stays with you your whole life, right? It's like other folks never learn that skill, but it's somehow you're like, I'm gonna have to go ahead and just make my case because apparently they don't believe that I could be from here or that I could come from here and not be part of this, a citizen of that country. And so you guys were in Singapore and Malaysia with a small stint in Houston. Apparently, all roads lead to Houston at some point for most people, or Texas. Oddly enough, did you guys left from Malaysia and went to
We
Colorado?
did, yeah.
Okay, how long were you in Colorado for?
We're in Colorado for 2 years.
So I'm going to ask this question only because someone asked this question of me yesterday in an interview. I'm just curious. What was the harder move? Was it moving to Asia for the first time or the second time? Because I know Houston was in the middle. Or was it coming back to the States, either coming back to Texas the first time or coming back to Colorado after you had lived both in Singapore and Malaysia?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think culturally it was more difficult moving back to the United States, but developmentally where I was, um, I had a much harder time actually moving back to Malaysia. So maybe we thought like, oh, what a relief we're going back, uh, and I think this is the other interesting thing. My mother also had a really difficult time adjusting because I think she was expecting like it was going to be similar, but as you know, there's just Malaysia and Singapore can be night and day in some things. One and
Yes.
how the government is and how like organized things are or not. And
Yes.
but for me, it was like this little pre-adolescent transfer from being just like a kid to like entering the world where there are mean girls and like the
Yeah.
popular kids. And it just felt like
Right.
a lot had happened. And so that was a huge learning experience for me in adapting to an international school because what had happened is it took me time to actually break into like the English speaking group.
Interesting.
I actually, well, my best friend for a long time was a Japanese student and she was just learning English. And so I was like kind of learning Japanese to communicate with her. And our families actually became very, very good friends. But it was very interesting. I think like it was a interesting reminder, maybe for my whole family, that every move is different. So even if you think you got it,
Mm.
there is no really going back. It's never the same.
Can I ask why it was hard at that point to get into that English speaking group?
It,
Because I presume that's your first
yeah,
language.
exactly. So I think it was just clicky. And
Mm.
like it was a smaller, newer international school, and so I think there was just like less students, and they had clicked the year before, and so then when I arrived for that new year, it was just harder to like to, and eventually they became my best friends. Eventually, I totally did
Mm.
break into this group, and like we hung out all the time. It was just, but I think it was like when I look back now as an adult, it was a very interesting thing to look at group dynamics and sort of what happens
Hmm.
in international schools. And it's not just like, oh, we're this cohesive multicultural society here, that
Right.
there are still like the popular kids and it might not look like it does in American schools. And there are these like these belonging needs and trying to assimilate and fit in to whatever the ongoing culture is. So there's so much adjustment and adapting, and every kid and every age and every country and every school culture could be another challenge. It could be another aspect to the move.
So then I guess from leaving that though, you get to Colorado and you spent 2 years. Is that 2 years in the States and then you guys went somewhere else?
After that, my family stayed in the U.S. We did go to Texas right before I started high school, and so I have the privilege of Austin, Texas, being my hometown now because of that. But the time in Colorado was really interesting because it was very white. It was a suburb of Boulder,
Boulder.
Louisville, Superior, and we were
Yeah.
actually just a few minutes away from the Columbine shooting, and we were there in school that day. It was very memorable, and how that affected that entire like community and region. Uh, so it was interesting. I guess if I had to capture my Colorado time, it was I felt very much like a fish out of water and out of place, but generally it was a very kind group. And like our time in Colorado was like a very beautiful time. I don't know what it was that was like kind of different, maybe from our Katie experience. I think it did help being there the whole 2 years opposed to just the 6 months. It kind of gave time to
Yeah.
adapt and find our people and our place.
So here's what I find interesting. So Colorado for you kicks off an extended period in the States, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm assuming either finishing middle school, high school, and then what ultimately would be college, right? In that period. Okay. There's always a fun part, not fun part at all. For the TCK who's kind of traveled around, you relocate to Texas and in terms of of sort of identity, right? You had mentioned sort of some of the challenges early on. What did that look like for you? Because of that, you've come back to Texas at this point. You've lived in a couple of countries, you've lived in a couple other places, and were you still trying to figure out identity? Was it something that you were like, okay, well, I've had these experiences, but now I'm Texan? Like, what was it for you?
Absolutely. And I think that the identity thing is ongoing. I mean, I think I had another major opening all the way through graduate school. So it was sort of an ongoing. I will call so this period that I was in Texas a little bit of my like for high school, a bit of my whitewashing. Like
Mm,
it was the phase where I really was um pressured or really trying to assimilate. I think the Colorado years was really me trying to figure out what it is to be an American because I had left when I was 6 years old, telling everyone I'm American in Southeast Asia and coming back and not
hmm
understanding what is homecoming. Explain to me what
hmm
football is. And
hmm
so I like started to grasp these things. But then in Texas, I managed to go through, this was the first time actually we lived anywhere in my life for 4 years. So I did all 4 years
hmm
in high school, and part of that was my family. We're just like, okay, we've been so mobile. I think it's getting harder to do these moves and to separate the kids from best friends. But now that these attachments are getting deeper, and so it's interesting because I actually have both experiences, being with TCK and of really being able to put down roots somewhere a little bit, kind of later in life at 14. But high school, I went to really an all American high school, like red, white, and blue. And with our colors, we had a huge football team. We won state a couple times. What I learned later, years later, even pretty recently, is that our high school was established as part of the white flight out of the cities during integration. So my school, if I had to estimate, it was something like 96% white, and it was a huge high school. And so I really found myself like I trying to fit in. Like I really brought an international perspective, but I was kind of like the exotic one, and uh, there wasn't really other models or really even enough like other minorities to really like connect and understand what was that. So I was just oftentimes like the only minority in this group of kids at a party or as part of this club.
hmm
So that was a very interesting experience, and I think it allowed me to sort of have this. I've been talking about this with another colleague who was really looking at like BIPOC mental health professionals and um, the barriers to getting licensed and things like that, even within the United States. And I think some of this like really helped me to have these experiences and understand white culture and sort of be a part of it. And then since then, it's been like my great undoing. It's been lovely. It's been coming full back circle and reconnecting with all of these. And now I think this like white American culture I can identify with is also part of mine. It's also something I grew up in and of, and can see like
hmm
the positives from that. And I also can experience like, some of the harms that it does if we're unaware or ignorant of the impact of being in just these bubbles, these white bubbles, without a lot of diverse experiences or faces.
I think that that is a great transition point that I want to hit to after the break because I really want to talk about these bubbles that we can find ourselves in. You are obviously, and they all know this from the intro, you're a psychologist, but also you have lived as an adult in a lot of different areas, right? That just took us through your kind of your upbringing, but really starting to kind of unpack some of these spaces that we find ourselves in and would love to talk about how mental health plays a role in that. So if y'all hang on with us, we'll be back with you after the break.
This message comes from one of our affiliate partners, FlexJobs. FlexJobs has 100% verified job listings, career experts, and resume help. They've helped people find great remote jobs since 2007. If you're looking for your next remote opportunity and want to save up to 30% when you sign up for a membership, visit theblackexpat.com/codes to learn more.
All right. So, her story has taken us, I feel like, around the United States and around the Malaysian Peninsula. And this part I think is going to be interesting to weave, because part of it has to do with your professional identity and your training, and part of it has to do with sort of how your identity has sort of grown in all the places, or has been reframed in some of the places that you've lived as an adult. And so, as I mentioned before that we went off for break, you were in Texas, and I know that you went to, I believe, the University of Texas at Austin. Is that where you went for undergrad?
Yeah, undergrad, University of Texas, UT.
All right. We won't hold that against you. Anyway.
Well, I went to grad school at Texas A&M, so everybody hates me.
Everybody hates you on both sides. And so
get to piss off both sides of Texas.
Of course, because why? Oh, whatever. It's big enough; they can handle it. Anyway, so I'm curious. So at the grad level, right? What did you end up studying? What was your goal professionally?
Oh yeah, you know what though? I should go a little bit into undergrad, because I was a double major in psychology and history. Mm-hmm. And it was really confusing for me in a way, because I just loved both and I couldn't see me giving like one up. And I think it was a very rare major combination. So for a little while I was toying with I was on the debate team in high school. So was I going to use my history degree to go to law school, or was I going to use my psychology degree to go to grad school? And eventually I did choose counseling psychology PhD program, and I went what I would say is 2 hours away to the other side of the world, from UT to Texas A&M. And for this is kind of irrelevant in the international context, but for those of you who know that UT is one of the most liberal, progressive, really college campuses, and A&M is one of the most conservative in the country. So it was really these two polar extremes, 2 hours drive away from one another. And that in and of itself was a very interesting cross-cultural experience, going from sort of inner city hippie Austin to cowboy country, which I actually felt kind of well suited for, given that my parents had, we'd spent our childhood summers on the ranch, mm-hmm. and in rural parts of Texas. So, but I was definitely, this multicultural aspect became very, very salient living in this rural university.
I think it's funny that sometimes we don't realize that those skills can very much be used domestically, especially depending how big and diverse a country is, or even if not, right?
Oh, totally. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because Texas is as big as some countries, right? Just as a state. Mm-hmm. No, really. I mean, not to be funny, it's a big state. I've driven across it.
Yeah.
And so it shouldn't even be surprising that if you go from one part to the other, it's different. But, I think also when we tell stories of cultures and places and people, we really want to put things in a box. It's so easy to just say, well, all X, Y, and Z is this, right? But there's nuance. And a state like Texas, where there's a certain quote unquote identity, there's nuance. You're right. Austin is very different from I would say a Dallas, or from an El Paso, or from a San Antonio, or any of the little places in between. What did you think you were going to do? I have an idea, but did you see yourself working with those with an international perspective? Or was it just, I'm interested in the subject matter, and then that kind of came later?
Yeah, not at all. I mean, really, I was thinking I would just have a little private practice, probably in Austin, and have this flexible schedule and help people, and that'd be great. And it's just I sort of fell into into, I don't even know what to call it, an abyss that I never want to get out of, I suppose, because,
Okay.
and I really love that I actually discovered this international psychologist dream for me in College Station in this rural
Hmm.
Texas county. And there is so many parallels that showed up, mainly being the need for like rural mental health services, that in these counties that people are having to drive 2-3 hours just to get to a mental health professional, and having culturally competent care. So I ended up having, both personally and professionally, this huge multicultural blossoming and unpacking that happened for me out of grad school. And it was like, part of it is I was, for example, part of the Hispanic Graduate Student Association, and started salsa dancing. And my best friend was Mexican American, and just exposed me to all of these different cultural pockets that I fell in love with. We actually traveled to Mexico together. And I also started getting in touch with the International Indian Student Association, and really started reconnecting with sort of my heritage, and realizing like I'm really not Indian. Like this is, or understanding what it was as an adult, which I hadn't done since the Singapore Malaysia days, right? As a kid. And sort of, so that's why I was saying this period of actually being in the supposedly very homogenous, like white place, was actually very full of very culturally rich experiences that actually really pushed me to look for it more and to have more of these cross-cultural encounters.
I find that really interesting. I mean, let's talk a little bit more about kind of connecting with the International Indian Student Association, right? I'm presuming, but just based on the name, that those students were those who had come to the United States from India or maybe some other parts of the world to study.
So they were international students, yeah.
Right, obviously. And
Opposed
so,
to us diaspora South
right.
Asians.
How did those dynamics work? Because I think even within I hasten to say, even an Indian American context, your context is still still different, right? Like, because
Absolutely.
your family didn't come directly from India and immigrate here; they came from the Caribbean. So how did those conversations and nuances go for you?
Exactly. I think that was, I think, a part that contributed to like this belonging struggle. And it's something that I think a lot of Indians from India are actually maybe even now becoming aware, or like unaware of the extent of the diaspora. That there are Indians in Fiji, Mauritius, South Africa, pretty much anywhere the British Empire was, you will find Indians now.
Right. Uganda, yes.
Yes.
Right.
And that there's these different pockets and nuances, exactly. And so there is, like, I think, some education, or there may even be some judgment, especially maybe with older generations, on looking at who left and whether it was their choice or not, and like how far we may or may not have strayed from the values. And I think there's sort of also, on the Caribbean side, what do we do? What are our customs, and how are they different? And so, since we actually haven't, we did travel to India when we were living in Singapore, but other than that, we haven't lived in India. And so a lot of my contact with like other Indian communities had been these diaspora communities. So the international students were pretty awesome. I think that they were already the small, like, isolated group. And it was a very interesting bridge for me, because they were living in sort of my world, in my Texas ranchy world.
Yeah.
And they kind of just appreciated that I reached out. And there were certain things that I just felt like, I feel like the food is one of the first things, but I learned how to make like the most delicious chai from like one of these students, and I like still use that recipe everywhere. So it was a way of reconnecting even in the middle of this place. But there were other times where we would go out for like where all the student bars and clubs were, and there would be like this couple they're kissing outside of the door. And so one of the guys told me, if this was India right now, there would be an entire crowd watching them. And like, I know this now, but at the time I was just like, what, really? Like it's that inappropriate kind of thing. And so really having a sense to know of like where my cultural meter was, and that you don't actually have to be going overseas to understand what your culture is. It really is interacting with people from other cultures where you can start to see what your lens is, what your worldview is. Yeah.
No, I think that that's great. I mean, there's so many commonalities in what you've said that I think about that happens for a lot of diasporic communities, right? Where it's it's always this. I don't want to use the word tension because I feel like it's a negative connotation, but there's this difference, right, between the folks who kind of stayed from the, I guess, from the source, for whatever, and then the people who left for whatever reason, circumstance,
Yeah.
or whatever. And so I always think about, yeah, it's sometimes hard to explain, like, especially when you're the only one of you somewhere else and everyone says, oh, you're this, right? But then you meet the people who are like, for real, like just got off the plane from there. And then you're like, I'm not as much as I thought. I mean, I'm kind of this, I'm the like light version, right? Like I'm not in its pure form. I'm the like, I don't want to say watered down, but you know what I mean? It's like dark chocolate, milk chocolate, white chocolate.
Right. Exactly. And it was interesting to kind of interact with them understanding, like they're living, working, going to school in this environment. They understand the environment that I have acculturated to.
Yes.
And so we could really, like, I could really ask the questions more or less and not have to be stepping around like, how am I being judged here for my naivete?
Even for me in college, I love like the international student, the African student unions, all of that were the best, I think, because you're right. It's sort of the best of both worlds, right? You get people like you get it because we're in the same environment, even if we started different, right? And we're still navigating this shared identity, even though our experiences are once again different. And so I know throughout this, we were talking about this offline, somehow throughout your graduate experience, postgraduate experience, you go back abroad. So at some point in the story, it's either Fiji or France. I'm trying to keep it straight. Right after you finish your degree, is that correct? Which one was it?
Yes. So it was very interesting. So I told you I started traveling, and Mexico was actually the first country that I tried to backpack, but I knew not at all what I was doing. I did not show up with a backpack. I showed up with a suitcase that I very quickly regretted. My first trip was I went to Mexico. I just knew I wanted to travel again. Like there was some part of me that wanted to go. And so I planned a backpacking trip with a friend who just backpacked Europe, but I had no idea what I was doing. I literally showed up with a suitcase that I like quickly regretted the moment we landed. It was like,
okay.
But I'm so proud of myself for just like I having this international craving and really honoring it. And it was like some moment in a hostel where there was like 3 languages being spoken in the common area. Yeah. And all of a sudden, like some light bulb turned on. It was like my TCK light bulb. And I was like, this is where I belong. Like the place where there's like these languages you don't understand, or a little bit, these like all these people who are from this no belonging background. And so something after that, I was traveling between every semester. I had an international trip planned, and I was desperately trying to get it out of my system so that I could come back and quote unquote get a real job and like settle down close to my clients.
Right.
Because this was like way before the age of telepsychology. This was like before the age of TripAdvisor. This was Lonely Planet days, guys. Right. And so I ended up taking a year off after I finished my PhD. because there's a whole other process we need to do to get licensed. And I followed a partner at the time who was teaching English in France. And so I was living in Paris for a little while. And then I thought, there's no point in me learning French or like investing in my backpacker budget on French classes, because I'm a Texas girl and I really need to work on Spanish.
Spanish,
And
right.
so I went to Spain and I enrolled in a language school there for like 6 months. And then on every break, I was traveling to other countries in Europe and Morocco. And so I call that my post-PhD gap year, because we don't have a gap year,
Right.
in the US. And my parents, frankly, would not have let me take one. It was like, so I make this joke of like, I had to get a doctorate before you like let me
Right.
go.
Can I jump in with the ironies about the Spanish? Can I? Because you're in Cameroon, which is predominantly Francophone, right? You're not in Texas.
The irony is
and
that
you're
I
married.
fell in love with a French guy. Yeah.
Sorry, I was like, I was like, wait a minute, she's not even anywhere that's using Spanish.
That's exactly what happened, and so that's the other twist and turn. So I went and did whatever I could after I got licensed to just get a position overseas. And I landed in Fiji, teaching at the university there. And that is where I met my partner, who's French. And so, and then I moved to Cameroon with him because of his work. So there's, the full international expat, everything just, you never really know.
Did we learn the French though? Or is it still like, nah? Did you ever?
We're learning the French now. Yes, exactly. I mean, in some ways it's okay this way, to actually be, learning an environment, know you have to use it, but it was just, it was so ironic with all of this.
Funny
you just
to
never
me, right?
know. And that's why I laugh when I tell that story. I was like, what am I going to learn French for? And I couldn't see any use for it. It was so funny at the time, but something keeps bringing me back. And so I think it was an interesting thing, because I spent a lot of my time actually running, I think, from the international lifestyle, the global lifestyle. It took me a while before I really got that, like, it was going to be more than just traveling every chance I got, that there was something more there. And then in Fiji was the first time I think I really got to develop my professional identity as an international psychologist, and what that means and what I could do. And so that's what I mean by the sort of abyss I fell in that I don't think I ever want to get out of, because I love that I sort of followed what it felt like at the time, this like selfish need for vacation.
Yeah.
And but it was my following this passion, and I didn't know where the road would lead, but it really is leading full circle.
And let's talk about that a little bit deeper, because one of the things that I think I've always struggled, even with the work they do with the Black expat, is that it's been kind of hard to identify, BIPOC. So for folks who don't know what that term is, Black, Indigenous, people of color, practitioners and clinicians and mental health professionals, right, who understand some of this international life nuances. And that's not to say that someone living domestically could not be a great clinician or practitioner, right? Working with expats, working with third culture kids, working with all these different dynamic groups. But there is something to be said when someone kind of understands that extra layer. And one of the challenges I've said, is just finding folks who have that intersection, like your story, right? Because none of our stories are the same, but then they're similar, right? Yes. Who have that perspective, and then working with clients. And so one of the things I'm really interested in hearing from you is just in the work that you're doing, right? Obviously you have your own personal well to kind of draw from, but also your training. What are maybe some of the nuances to the experiences you're seeing with maybe expats of color and community expats of color, or even how identity kind of plays itself out when people are moving to these different places, and particularly if they're a minority in those spaces?
Yeah. And I think one of the biggest challenges is maybe telling our stories or having them integrated on our end. Because
Mm,
I think that's the thing that's missing. I think that even in the United States, like the international experience aside, there's so much work and unpacking we need to do with our own identity and our own belonging stories. And very few of us are like strictly like bicultural. I mean, there's like that doesn't mean just one thing. You have a different mix, and there's different spaces where you amplify different parts of your identity intentionally or maybe unintentionally if you're really not aware of how these different parts of identity are actually coming together. And then I think when going internationally, that puts it in a whole nother context that's also in flux. So my and nuanced and layered, and as we were talking about, it's never really the same. So Fiji was, for example, a very interesting experience for me. This is my first time being an adult and being able to blend in as local, and people speaking to me in Fijian Hindi with me really not being able to, like, we're passing as local, and having some cultural overlap. In fact, what we discovered is a lot of cultural overlap with the Caribbean in terms of the cuisine, for example, more than like continental India, which was very interesting to discover. But then having to explain your story to so many different contexts and different people, that I just wonder if we have a chance to do enough of this like identity work on our own end, on the back end of understanding like the pain points and the celebratory points, and like what about it makes it our superpower, or how is it our strength, or how is it our resilience. Because there's not a lot of spaces or places where we can really carefully unpack that
mhm, mhm.
and look at how these different threads can come together in a cohesive way, in an integrative way, where you feel like a full person, where you can express, you know, and represent all your identities, and that maybe in different degrees or in different contexts.
I also I also think it's interesting when I listen to former third culture kids who then become expats, because there's I feel like there's a shifting, right? Because now you're an adult, and maybe there's more of awareness of even kind of what your parents went through through moving,
Mm.
right? So looking at your expat experience as an adult, and we're talking about identity, do you think that, I mean, your parents had to unpack some things, right? Coming from Guyana, going to the US, and then, keeping kind of moving internationally. What do you think, if you sort of can think back to their experiences, at least at what you remember of as a kid, and of course that's clouded by being a kid,
Mhm.
what do you think that you sort of you're doing things that may be similar to what they did, or are you is your expat experience looking different? And maybe even how, and I know you have the added caveat that you are a professional
Mhm.
psychologist, so there's always a lot of reflection that goes on in terms of, when I think about this, maybe this wasn't the most healthy or whatever. But how do you think your experiences even look different, just in how you're doing expatriation? And even if you
Mhm.
want to take it broader, if it makes it simpler, and I don't know if it does make it simpler, just even identity, right? And how you're kind of navigating the world.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think that my parents didn't necessarily have the same, like, I think maybe that's why in some ways I talked about that, of like this, where do you unpack your identities, and how do you deal with it. So I think in some ways, materially, we were more taken care of in these corporate placements overseas, but that also created more of this like insulation of being in the expat bubble. And I think there are definitely things that they did that got us out of that, that were different. And we weren't like part of the American club and, and attempted to, but we never really learned the languages. And so that's something that's been different. I think me living here or in Fiji or just trying to, and I think it depends on how much psychological space and energy you have to that too. I also feel like there's kind of this thing in expat circles of this pressure of like learn the language or else it means you're not integrating. And I think, yes, that's part of it, but I think there's also honoring where you are in your life, what you have energy for, what you have space for. And I think there's a lot of things that we kind of add on top of like this burden that we have to do this way and that way. And I think maybe another thing that I've had more of a privilege of, I would say, is my parents being part of this journey to some extent with me. So I think that this part I'm very lucky is that, I mean, I blame them in a way that I'm living so far because they gave me the bug to travel, but I'm lucky in that they'll come visit me. And my mom has spent quite a bit of time with me at different points in Fiji, especially. And I got a whole new experience of what it is to be intergenerational, maybe as an expat. And it's very communal, the culture there. And I feel like I have relationships with people there I wouldn't have otherwise had if I didn't have like mom in tow, more or less. And seeing us as this mother-daughter pair and traveling together. And there was certain aspects that I think she was able to bring in from her childhood, like these communal aspects. My mom is a big cook, so when I was at work, she would be cooking more food than for the two of us. So she would just like go around to the neighbors with, and I would just never think to do that or be kind of shy in a way. And it's funny is she doesn't do this in Texas, you know. And so there was like parts of her identity that kind of was able to come out, and I got to learn about her childhood through that experience. So I don't know if it's an exact answer to your question, but there is something about being an intergenerational expat that I really feel privileged to, really seeing different aspects of my family's identity come up, or as my sisters have come. One of them was saying to me, this is the irony in Fiji that there's actually a lot of Caribbean students and young professionals because it's part of, sort of the Commonwealth and similar. And so I threw a Guyanese party, my first Guyanese party ever. I threw in Fiji, and my sister was there, and she reflected back. This is actually the first party she had been to where there wasn't a white person, and that was probably just because my partner had already moved to Cameroon at that point. I was kind of closing up shop in Fiji, but it's been like my traveling experience. I've been sort of been able to bring my family along for the ride, and we've been continuing to grow together, and it's adding to our experiences and our story as a family. So that's been really special. Yeah, and I know, and I guess that was something unexpected out of our story in particular. That
I don't think we talk enough about, and it's interesting about what you said about your mom making enough food and giving it to neighbors. It's not something she necessarily does in Texas, but like,
yeah,
I don't think we talk enough about what people leave behind when they move. Do you know what I mean? So when you leave your home space, and I particularly say this for generations that are older than ours, right? So I think about people who left countries in the 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s, and beyond, right? I don't think there's always this deep dive in terms of, yes, they've moved to this other country for this experience, but there is some there is some loss and there's some grief, right? Because you are leaving what you know.
Mhm.
And you see this in TCK literature now. And I think you're seeing more talking about grief. But I think just in general, and I always particularly think about expats and immigrants of color because that doesn't get even dived as much as maybe some other spaces. And so it's interesting to sort of hear it's sort of like some things have risen to the top that were always in your mom, but like where
Yes,
you were allowed a space for her to like let that bubble to the surface, right? That maybe doesn't always get some shine. Does that make kind of some sense there?
absolutely. And just to see her and connect with her in this other way. And I think you're right, because there's this element of the grief, which we know about now. I don't think we really knew about that in the early 90s. But in my family, if you think about what my parents went through, I mean, it's sort of like grief from leaving another, they left a whole world behind and still haven't been back, right?
Yeah.
And so for them to understand or contextualize or even support us as parents for kids to explain or articulate those losses that didn't really happen, or for us to figure out what to do with them. And I
Mm,
think it was much more of a, well, the world will always misunderstand us, is
mm,
what I was getting. And something that's been happening, I think, more recently, and maybe more out of my experience, is we've been able to do this work a little bit more together
mm,
of unpacking, like, and remembering what are these things that were left behind about their
mm,
childhood or their values. And one thing that is talked about is this sort of loss of community.
mm,
And I think it happened more so because we also left, like, New York, and I have a lot of family in Florida, these epicenters of Caribbean culture and spaces, to be in Texas. And so there isn't that built-in community even there.
mm,
And somehow it can get expressed in Vanuatu or Fiji, these Pacific Island countries. And uh, I think that's sort of like the beauty of, like, the global citizen prototype,
mm,
that we talk about what TCKs can be or what they could do. So at its best is finding these transcultural connections and values and humanity and expression, and we're always going to be a mix of identities now. This is what globalization is. This is
mm,
what communities are struggling with. Uh, is that their young people are going to be more westernized, even if they never leave the country, because they're
mm,
consuming that media or the education system, and what are the international benchmarks are westernized.
mm,
They're uh, they're from, what, in psychology research, most of it is from these weird societies, right?
right.
Westernized, educated, industrialized, democratic,
Right.
and rich countries.
Right.
Weird, the weird acronym that we use a lot in cross cultural psychology. Uh, so,
Yeah. So, follow up question, because I know a lot of your work and you have a interest, of course, in being inclusionary. How do you think, especially as we think about expat bubbles, how can we be more inclusionary or at least sensitive to the different groups that are kind of filtering in and out? I think that's a big topic, especially with the kind of year 2020 was politically, and this idea of DEI. Well, there's some the core, the diversity, equity, inclusion, and then justice may be added at the end, or belonging, depending on what group you're with. But what do you just think as a practitioner, like practically, what are ways and spaces that communities that are highly mobile can still be mindful and be inclusionary and create these safe spaces for everyone to kind of survive and thrive?
yeah, and I think this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, because I disagree with the idea that just because you've had these international experiences, it means that you're internationally competent, multiculturally competent, or automatically sensitive. Yeah, I think that's been, I think, the biggest part of my journey. And on top of that, being a psychologist who's really like focused on diversity and cultural issues. And I think the biggest surprise to me as an adult, especially moving through Fiji, Cameroon, and places that are lesser developed than the United States, is my privilege and the saliency of my American identity. And the script really flipped. It went from really trying to sort of prove myself as an American and I belong here to suddenly having to, what could be perceived as having to defend American policies, things, the role that the American government has played in the Pacific, for example, and nuclear testing and all these things that we didn't really learn about as Americans in school. And then now married to a French person and being in Cameroon um, un, under the French, with the French government. So really understanding that there are now colonizer identities that have become part of how I'm moving through this world and the spaces, as a brown person. And so there's a lot to unpack there. I think in the middle of just being an expat, there's so much of us trying to just move from the chaos to find stability, build our own lives, and sort of develop being self-resilient and having a community, building a community along the way. But on top of that, I think that's something I didn't really expect to have to unpack to the level that I did, of who am I really going to be in this world? Like, what is my identity going to be here? If I look at creating a value-based life and how I'm going to manifest that in this new place. I think that this is powerful work that can be kind of scary, but as a TCK, as a person of color, I can't imagine not being better positioned to actually be grappling with these questions, because when you're living a global life, you are having a global impact, and it really could be for good. And there's not really easy answers to this question. But I don't think we did devote enough psychological space to really unpacking and thinking about that. And even the ways that we can harness these identities of privilege, like if we are coming from westernized countries, or even if living in a westernized country, like living in Europe, but being in a space where maybe people aren't unpacking questions of race and privilege as much as we are in the United States, and having that awareness. Now thinking about what do I do with this in a global context? I think these are powerful questions about how we live our lives as expats, as people abroad, as ambassadors of our passport countries, more or less, or as global citizens, and developing that identity of global citizenship.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for taking the time to not only unpack your own story, but to share what you're seeing, and to really see, especially through your professional lens, because I know that you've just given me a lot of things to really think about, and I know that those who are listening in are definitely going to reflect back. And so with every guest that comes on here, I just like to ask, so if someone wants to work with you, let me ask this first, because I always have to ask this of my therapists and counselors. Are you, what does your license cover? So are you able to work with folks who are only in the US or in other parts of the world? Who are you able to take on?
Right. So for the most part, most of my therapy clients live and stay in Texas, although I am able to do therapy with some expats depending on what country that they are in. What I really recommend is doing coaching with me. If you are an expat or a nomad and you're moving around, and I'll sort of screen to see if coaching is appropriate for what you're looking for. If not, I'll try to help you find somebody where you are who can work with you with therapy. But if it is appropriate for coaching, then I can follow you through your many countries and many adventures. And that's why I offer both. And I also just Sorry. Yeah. I also wanted to mention that I also work with families, mostly with adolescents and adult relationships and with couples. So I really think it's important to work with the whole system. And so that's just one other way that I work with global folks.
And thank you for clarifying, because the more I do this, the more I'm like, I
Mm-hmm.
need to know what your license covers, right? and I will say, therapists and counselors have been very great about saying, I can do this if you're in this geographic region,
Exactly.
but I can't necessarily, depending on where you are. And so I think that's a very important reminder for those of you who are listening, who might be seeking specifically mental wellness assistance and help, that you just want to make sure you have a practitioner that is able to do what they need to do and can work with you based on where they are, because we don't want them to get in trouble because they're trying to help. And like I said, they're usually really good about making sure their licenses are fine, but still, I want to put that out there. So where can we find you on the interwebs?
All right. You can find my website at www.drneeta.com, on Instagram as the Global Psychologist, and I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook, all the things. So I'm sure Amanda will drop the links. Connect with me wherever you're at.
We will. I always say, if you can't wait, you can just go to any of our social medias. We're almost always following the people we have on the show. But I will have the information either in the show notes or up at the blackexpat.com. So when her episode is live, which if you guys are hearing it, it is live, all the contact information will be up on our website as well. Thank you once again for joining us. Like I said, super excited to find someone who is living in Cameroon.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. I know.
we made it happen. Took a bit, but we made it happen. So thank you guys all for listening. Until next time, we will meet up again.
You just heard an episode of the Global Chatter podcast, a project by the Black Expat. It's hosted by me, Amanda Bates, and it's edited by Stephanie Fuccio. To learn more about this podcast or to learn more about the Black Expat, visit theblackexpat.com.